So we're here today with Brendan Collins. He's the CEO of Avalo, and he's here to break down a little bit about the changing crop development that's done through AI, and especially how fast it's going. So Brendan, tell us a little bit about your company.
Yeah, so Avalo is a breeding company that is using AI to drastically improve crop breeding, but also using the insights that we're able to create to actually kind of reimagine how breeding is done. So taking it much further than just beyond traditional breeding that is this kind of constrained kind of paradigm and being able to open it up and incorporate a lot more diversity to get to outcomes much faster than you would ever be able to in a traditional breeding sense. By doing that, we're really trying to actually kind of incorporate AI across the entire value chain. So we've become more than just a seed company. We're actually also becoming a products company as we're doing in our cotton project, which means helping farmers with the seeds in their ground to actually produce the best cotton at the end of the day during harvest and actually being able to distribute that into the supply chain itself.
Sure. So cotton is a primary product you're working on. Also, I see you have a lot of work that you're doing in the areas of rubber, sugar, and rice. What caused you to pick out these four big ones?
Yeah, so we called that. I guess as we were developing this technology and we kind of saw the power of how big this could be, we really wanted to lean into hard problems. So we actually looked at the crops causing outsized externalities within our agricultural system. I mean, I think you only need to get into a plane and look at the window, flying over the Midwest to see how dramatically agriculture has actually shaped our world, probably more than any other industry on the planet. And so by being able to take new technologies, we really wanted to kind of lean into outsized problems because there's nothing inherently evil about these crops themselves. And we really need them in our lives, and they're so important to us culturally and all these other ways. But if we can just reduce the amount of impact that they have on the planet, we can also help farmers grow them more sustainably and more profitably.
Sure. Well, you hit on something I think about a lot. I have a lot of experience and investments in the area of Ukraine in the past, I guess in
Mhm.
Ukraine, and now in South America. And people underestimate the sheer size and scale. You talk about flying over the Midwest, where we see a lot of field sizes, maybe of, 2,000 acres, and we go down to Brazil and there's a lot of field sizes of 50, they're in hectares, but let's say 15,000 acre
Yeah.
equivalents. And, just the sheer size and scale of agriculture, I think is somewhat misunderstood and somewhat daunting to people sometimes.
Totally. I had a farmer in Texas. They said around these parts, they say that you can watch your dog run away for 3 days. And, that is basically just cotton fields as far as the eye can possibly see. And so I do think people, especially in cities, forget how big this industry is and kind of all the steps involved in actually getting this to the clothes that we wear or the food on our plates.
No doubt. So there's a lot of traditional ways that companies and individuals are developing, seeds and different technologies around growing and stuff like that. That I see you pitch with your company is that using some of the tools you guys have developed, you feel you can go a lot faster. Tell us about that. The speed and the importance of that. We're dealing with an industry that, obviously agriculture's been in the world for thousands of years now, and I think some critics would say it's been slow to develop. So, now you're looking at hyperspeed development. Tell us about that.
We're actually deploying AI on several levels and kind of like a stack to actually be able to bring these products to market much faster. But the kind of core problem we tackled originally, and this is a problem that not a lot of people think about, but is really this idea of how does the genome actually correlate to the traits that we see in the field? And, and this is true for humans too. I think a lot of people have a good concept of that eye color is, very heritable and or hair color or a lot of these traits that, we see in humans, those are driven only by a couple genes. And so this idea that, the gene to actually seeing someone's eye color is a very direct correlation. The number of traits that are that simple and that simple to understand in terms of what gene is producing what trait is very constrained and very narrow in as a whole. There's in humans, it isn't a single gene that determines how tall we are or how smart we are. There's thousands of genes interacting in really complex ways, all interacting with a dynamic environment that really produces that trait. In agriculture, I think that the most important trait for every farmer is yield, but there isn't a yield gene. No one is going to be able to go in and edit a single gene and make a corn that's,
They're trying.
5 times larger. Yield is one of the most complex traits. They're trying, but it's going to be almost an impossible task because it is thousands of genes and thousands of gene networks interacting with this really complex environment to actually be able to produce that trait at the end of the day. Yield is actually much more an environmental trait than it is a genetic trait, but you can try and control the genetics or adapt the genetics to that environment as much as possible. So what we really focused on in the beginning is being able to train AI models on the genome itself to understand what exactly are those thousands of genes that are contributing in small effects to produce that outcome. And once we understand those thousands of gene networks, how do we create predictive breeding algorithms to actually incorporate all those genes into a single plant as quick as possible? Because no gene editing company is going to be able to go in and edit one of those genes that is going to be necessary to get to the outcomes we really need to be able to see the differences that we want to be able to actually adapt these crops to the environments that they've been traditionally grown in.
So break down for us, how you're using AI, for instance, turn some of this raw genetic data into predictions about crop traits, things like that. And what is the process? As you know, a lot of the agriculture community is probably not quite as dialed in scientifically as you are with this process.
Yeah. So I'll try and break it down as simply as I can. But the first step is really understanding that genetic basis of complex traits. So what are the genes that are involved in producing yield, and how do those interact with the environment and that in those different ways? So understanding those gene networks and understanding if you're in a really dry environment, what genes are responsible for that. If you're in a really wet environment, what genes are responsible for that. And once we kind of have that fidelity and that really high resolution of those traits, and keep in mind, we're doing this for every trait. So we're doing this in cotton for all the fiber characteristics as well, because cotton farmers aren't only getting paid on the cotton yield, they get a premium if it's above a certain staple length or it has a certain fiber strength or other fiber qualities like micronair. So we're understanding the genetic basis of all those different traits. And then the other thing that once we have that understanding of the genetic basis of all those traits, we can expand what our starting population looks like. Because being able to really hone in on such high resolution and such good fidelity within the genome, we can say, okay, when you're recombining these two plants, what are the good genes in plant A and what are the good genes in plant B? And when you recombine and you actually scan the progeny of that, which ones inherited the best outcomes of those? But the other thing that we're able to incorporate AI on is we have a good sense of how DNA likes to recombine between parents, what chunks of DNA like to go together. And one thing that is a kind of consequence of breeding is the more wild a plant is, the more randomly it will actually cross all its genetic code with another individual. And so this is called linkage disequilibrium. And the more you're able to break that up, the more genetic recombination you can get in a single go. So what we're now able to do, and we're employing AI, is being able to future forecast those different simulations and what happens to a population as you start to incorporate those wild genetics. And so what this looks like in practice is expanding the diversity pool that we bring into a breeding program, and then being able to look ahead in time as all these crosses happen in the computer in simulation. What are the outcomes that we can actually get to? And so if we want to achieve X outcome, what is the shortest distance from the starting population to that outcome, and what are the crosses that we actually have to make to be able to achieve that? So step one is deploying AI to understand the genetic basis of complex traits and using that understanding to then create predictive breeding algorithms, including the starting population, to race to an outcome as quick as possible.
So one of the more successful businesses I started was a crop testing business, actually, in Eastern Europe. And almost all of our work was in the field. We would work with, seed companies and chemical companies, things like that, that already developed a product. It sounds like you're saying much of your business is based more, for lack of a better word, in the back office. How much of what you do is, through the computers with your science team, things like that,
Mhm.
and how much is actual field work that's being done?
And so increasingly, so historically, it's been almost all compute. But one thing we really realized is that we wanted to be able to, genetics is only half the equation. The thing that you can't control for is the environment. So if we're working with the breeding company, we only have access to, that first half of the levers and being able to guide them on the genetics. And we realized that we wouldn't be able to get to the outcomes we wanted unless we were able to control both the agronomy and the environmental conditions as well. And so we wanted to be able to actually implement this in the real world. We wanted to be able to speed to outcomes much faster and not be constrained by the cycles of a traditional breeding company. So we incorporated an entire plant technician team, greenhouse technician team, and a field labor team to be able to get these products into the world as fast as possible. So now we're about split evenly between the computers and the real world field itself, because I think computers are cool, and I love that we can do these simulations in the computers themselves, but it doesn't mean anything to the world until it actually gets into a field, until there is an actual physical product that farmers can interact with. It doesn't matter how good your simulations are.
So I've seen in doing some reading about what you're doing, something called zero shot breeding. Can you explain what that's all about?
So I think zero shot breeding, one thing I hate about buzzwords is, it's hard to define, or everyone has a different definition of it. And, AI itself has become such a buzzword. And, whether it's one of the large language models or a different field of machine learning, everything gets kind of incorporated into these overall umbrellas. And I think one issue with zero shot is a little bit of a fuzzy term, but from my perspective, I view zero shot breeding as, so if we've never seen a plant before, or a particular variety of plant before, someone just brings us a cotton seed, and all we have access to is that cotton seed. We're not going to grow it out in the field. But we have an idea of where it's going to actually be grown. So let's say it's going to be grown in West Texas. How much of the attributes of that seed can I predict from just understanding the characteristics of the seed itself? So being able to do an NIR, near infrared scan on the seed and being able to take a small DNA sample of that seed. How accurately can I predict the end of life phenotypes from that seedling? And I would say, we've been doing that. We started doing that 2 years ago. So I think we're kind of beyond the zero shot breeding, and we've really progressed into a new space of where not only can we tell you things about a plant that we've never seen before, we can tell you things about a whole population that we've never seen before. So what we really want to know, and where we're pushing within the breeding programs, especially on the computational side and the simulation side, is we want to understand what is the global maximum that you can achieve in fiber length, yield, and fiber quality, as well as drought resilience, and how low can you drive nitrogen-based fertilizers in a West Texas environment? What is the absolute maximum from all the cotton populations that exist on the planet that could actually be grown in that field, and how do we get to that outcome? So that is where we're pushing the technology
So
right
so
now.
so to that end, what's a real world success story you can tell us that's
Yeah.
relatable?
So obviously we're doing this big scale up in cotton and also in sugarcane, one of the most complicated genomes on the planet. But we started much more humbly with a much simpler crop in broccoli. So we were working with this really cool robotic indoor greenhouse company out of California, and they had these really interesting constraints, and they wanted to be the first company to sell broccoli at the supermarket from a greenhouse or a vertical farm situation. So vertical farms, everyone knows they're kind of on the out, but they really struggled with being able to grow long season crops, and really struggled to be able to grow cold tolerant crops. So broccoli is something that no vertical farm or commercial greenhouse in the Central Valley had ever been able to produce at the supermarket. And part of the reason for that is, the big headed Italian broccoli is 120 day growing season. And to be able to be pest free in their greenhouses, they could only grow crops that were harvestable in under 45 days. And that's because no pest has a life cycle that is shorter than 45 days. And so if you can come in under that, you actually don't need to worry about pest because they won't be able to reproduce fast enough to actually be able to impact your crop. And so what we wanted to be able to do is take a broccoli and get it harvestable in under 45 days. The other constraints that we really had is they wanted to be able to sell the whole broccoli. So they wanted the leaves to be a kind of an alternative to kale because they're all the same family. They had this obsession with being super sustainable and being able to harvest and eat the entire crop itself. So the big-headed Italian broccoli has horribly bitter leaves. They're incredibly waxy, not palatable at all. And so we really had to go back to a lot of wild diversity. So we went and we explored the Chinese broccolis, the gailans, and a bunch of wild varieties. We grew over 600 different varieties in their greenhouses and literally measured everything we possibly could about these plants, including 3D models, the nutritional content, flavor profile, days to harvest, obviously being the most important one. And after a couple generations, we were able, through our technology, we're able to produce a variety that was harvestable in 37 days. And on top of that, it was incredibly palatable. The entire plant itself is delicious, so much so. There's a really famous agricultural center and restaurant just outside of New York City called Blue Hill at Stone Barns. That was kind of one of the first really farm to table restaurants. 2 Michelin star run by Dan Barber. And we've won several taste tests against the Guylon that they have been serving for over 10 years at the restaurant. So it does have this incredible flavor and nutrition profile on top of being able to be harvested that quickly. So I think that's one of the best real world examples of us being able to use this technology and a whole idea around new idea around breeding and be able to bring this to market much faster. So that was from idea to actually being able to deliver the broccoli was under 3 years.
Wow, that's a tremendous advancement you
Hmm.
guys made. Great success. I'd like to touch on something you mentioned earlier. You said that the sugarcane genome is extremely complicated. Sugarcane is an area that I work a lot with in our crop spraying businesses in Brazil. Explain that about sugarcane genome being so complicated.
Yeah, for sure. So I think a lot of people, we're all very human centric, and mapping the human genome in 2008 was a massive success for humanity as a whole. But I think one thing that's incredible is like the human genome really isn't that complicated. So humans are diploid compared to a lot of plants. Humans are incredibly simple. 2 copies of the genome and roughly 3.8 million base pairs, which is a respectable size. And just to compare, that's actually pretty similar to corn. Corn and humans have roughly the same size genome. Corn is also diploid, so 2 copies of the genome. If you move into something like sugarcane, though, sugarcane is a decaploid, meaning it has 10 copies of the genome. And on top of that, humans again are about 3.8 billion base pairs. Sugarcane is 16 billion base pairs per chromosome. So not only does it have 5 times the amount of chromosomes across the entire genome, each one of those is dramatically larger than the human genome. And so what that means is if you're trying to understand what genes are contributing to different outcomes in sugarcane, it is the statistical quagmire to actually really be able to understand what genes are contributing to those outcomes. And the idea, if you cross 2 sugarcanes, what you're going to get, like what traits from parent A and parent B are actually going to end up in that progeny is almost impossible to figure out computationally. So that's why bringing a new sugarcane to market is a 15-year process. It is really around being able to do as many crosses as you possibly can, and then just growing those out in the field and just eliminating the ones that aren't working over that 15-year period. So you're whittling it down to the only ones that actually have the traits that you care about. But as you can imagine, if you're actually able to predictively understand what traits are going to be heritable from plant A and plant B and bring that into progeny, there's this massive opportunity to be able to bring a much better sugarcane crop to market. Because really no one has ever been able to do that before because it is that statistically challenging. And just to put more numbers on it, so a really good analysis of the human genome will roughly look at 8 million markers across the genome. So like a marker is just kind of like a flag in the genome to try and understand what is happening in that given region. And that'd be a really high resolution marker of the human genome would be roughly about 8 million markers. Our marker panel for sugarcane is 145 million markers across that 16 billion base pairs. So just the scale of understanding the sugarcane genome is pretty daunting. But which I think is kind of crazy because it's just basically a really tall grass.
It's tall and growing very thickly, people misunderstand too. A lot of room for bugs and pests and stuff in there too.
So I think that's one of the interesting things is, as a modeling company, is that's basically what we're always trying to understand is the unknown. And so we've gotten a pretty good idea of genetics. Where we're really trying to start pushing the modeling into now is understanding the environmental side of that. So this is starting to explore what is going on with the soil content, the microbes in the soil itself. How do those actually interact with the genome? What are the genetics that can take advantage of a good soil microbiome or versus a bad one? And really trying to understand how, weather events and be able to predict weather events interact with those genetics as a whole. So really expanding our scope into some of these harder to quantify areas or more unpredictable areas like weather and in soil content.
Give us some background on the company. How did this all come about?
Uh, this all came about. So this came about by meeting my best friend. Mariano was a brand new postdoc at Duke University. He was a computational evolutionary biologist, and a friend of a friend decided to bring him to a brewery that me and my friends were attending, and just kind of bringing him into the social group, because he hadn't made any friends in Durham, North Carolina yet. When Mariano was brought into that circle, I remember he just made like a hilarious joke, and that just turned into a lifelong friendship. So that was in 2016, and so for about 4 years, we'd get together after work over a couple of beers and just kind of talk about the problems that we were working on and just life and everything. And we just built this amazing relationship. I think he's just one of the most creative, hilarious human beings I've ever met, and really understanding what he was working on in his lab. And we kind of tinkered with this idea that we actually thought we had something pretty substantial by 2020, where we decided to just disclose the invention to Duke. Duke gave us exclusive rights to kind of the underlying technology for a small equity stake in the company, and paired us with an advisor that kind of was like, okay, this is how you business. And it turned into that snowballed into some early pre-seed investment, which we were able to get some really positive data in rice, and we were able to turn that into seed investment, and it was kind of just off to the races after that.
Startup stories are always interesting.
Yeah, this was very much our startup story is very much friendship based in beer.
Well, speaking of beverages, it sounds like you have a very important partnership brewing with a soda maker. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so one thing that was really cool is we had some of these early results in being able to do genomic predictions in sugarcane, kind of that no one else had been able to achieve before. And that was able to attract the attention of Coca-Cola Euro Pacific Partners, which is the largest Coke bottling company in the world. And so they take care of all of Asia and Europe itself. And so, as you can imagine, they buy quite a lot of sugar. And they have really aggressive scope 3 emissions reduction goals, especially by 2030. And this is something that every global corporation is really trying to wrangle with is, with their scope 1 and 2 emissions, they have some idea of how to control those, but things that get further and further removed from their production themselves. So scope 3, the CO2 that is actually being produced in the field itself is just a really hard challenge to actually tackle. But they heard about the work that we were doing in sugarcane, and we were able to get in touch with them, and they're just very impressed by it. And so they invested in our Series A and have been funding a project in Australia to really bring a more sustainable sugarcane to market in Australia. Because outside of having a really contributing to about half of their carbon footprint in sugar production, even though it's a smaller percentage of their total sugar portfolio, it has its outsized carbon footprint. But on top of that, all the nutrient runoff in the Queensland production in Australia goes straight into the Great Barrier Reef. So even though these farmers are trying to be really responsible, they're just the environment that it's growing in has these outsized consequences. So what we're partnering with them to do is to be able to deliver a much more efficient sugar cane, so we can catch more of that nitrogen in the field itself and lower the carbon footprint overall in sugarcane. So it's really great opportunity to be able to take and show kind of the consequences of entire supply chain. And what we're really excited about is it really represents this opportunity for an end brand that usually wouldn't care so much about the field itself or the farming production themselves, can actually apply back pressure to the market to bring a more innovative product to market. And so this is something that we're expanding in cotton and hoping to be able to show that this is possible across supply chains around the world.
Great. Well, thanks, Brendan. This has been really educational. We've been great. We've been very pleased to learn a little more about your company. And if our viewing public out there cares about the future of ag and AI, we encourage you to keep an eye on Avalo.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate it.